The altimeter holds steady at 11,000 feet. Flight Sergeant Malcolm Whiteley hunches over his chart table in the cramped fuselage of the Mosquito PRMK-16, the roar of the twin Merlin engines vibrating through the soles of his boots. It is 10:47 a.m., March 8, 1943. His hands, usually as steady as a surgeon's, are trembling. He isn't cold. He is terrified. The man the squadron calls the machine, the navigator who checks every calculation 3 times, has just realized he transposed 2 digits. He treated 19 degrees 50 minutes north as 19 degrees 5 minutes. They aren't over the IG Farben chemical plant near Krakow. They are 40 miles off course, deep in hostile Polish airspace. Malcolm? Squadron leader Carrington's voice crackles over the intercom, sharp with confusion. We're over the coordinates, but this isn't a factory. It's massive. Barracks. Chimneys. Miles of them. Whiteley leans toward the blister window, his stomach turning over. What neither man knows is that this navigation error hasn't just doomed their mission timeline. It has positioned them directly over the most guarded secret of the Third Reich. Whiteley is about to capture the first aerial proof of a place Allied intelligence believes is only a rumor, Auschwitz-Birkenau. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. By early 1943, the Allied understanding of the final solution is a chaotic puzzle of missing pieces. While the Polish government in exile sends desperate memos about mass executions and diplomatic cables from Switzerland hint at industrial-scale murder, the British and Americans remain paralyzed by skepticism. To the war planners in London and Washington, these reports sound like grim propaganda, exaggerations of war. They know labor camps exist, but the concept of a facility engineered solely for death is strategically inconceivable. The intelligence gap is absolute. There are no photographs. No reconnaissance plane has ever flown low enough or far enough east to bring back hard evidence of the gas chambers or the selection platforms. Without photographic proof, the pleas from Jewish organizations are dismissed as unverified reports by a military command focused on winning the war, not saving civilians. Winston Churchill is frustrated, caught between moral outrage and military pragmatism. In a classified memo from February, the sentiment is clear. The Allies need undeniable evidence before they can consider diverting bombers from strategic targets. On this cold March morning, Malcolm Whiteley is about to accidentally provide that evidence, though it will cost him his peace of mind for the rest of his life. Whiteley is the last person expected to break protocol. A 26-year-old former mathematics teacher from Cambridge, he treats navigation not as an art, but as a moral imperative. He doesn't just calculate, he obsesses. He keeps duplicate logs. He rechecks vectors until his eyes burn. His crewmates call him the machine because he never fails, but inside, Whiteley is driven by a crippling fear that a single misplaced decimal point will kill them all. He is the embodiment of order fighting the chaos of war. His pilot, squadron leader James Carrington, is his opposite. A 31-year-old pragmatist who flies by instinct and has seen too much combat to be shocked by anything. Together, they were sent to photograph a rubber plant. Instead, because the perfectionist made his first mistake, they are staring down at the smoke of the crematoria. And as Whiteley reaches for the camera controls, he isn't just correcting a navigation error. He is about to force the world to witness what it desperately wanted to ignore. By March 1943, the corridors of power in London and Washington were haunted by a horror that had no shape. The war maps in the cabinet war rooms were covered in markers denoting divisions, flotillas, and industrial targets. But there was a void in the east where something darker than warfare was taking place. The Allies were fighting a visible enemy, the Wehrmacht, the Luftwaffe, the U-boats strangling the Atlantic, but they were also grappling with a ghost. Reports were filtering out of occupied Poland, whispers carried by the desperate breath of the resistance, speaking of industrial slaughter on a scale that defied human comprehension. But in the sterile light of intelligence briefings, whispers were not proof. The files on the desks of the British Foreign Office and the U.S. State Department were thickening, yet they remained agonizingly inconclusive. In August 1942, Gerhard Riegner had sent a telegram from Geneva warning of a Nazi plan to exterminate all Jews in occupied Europe. It was dismissed by many as alarmist rumors, the sort of atrocity propaganda that had tarnished the credibility of intelligence during the Great War. Then came the testimony of Jan Karski, the Polish courier who had walked through the Warsaw Ghetto and witnessed the loading of death trains. He had brought his eyewitness account to the West in late 1942, describing a machinery of death that was systematic and relentless. Yet, skepticism paralyzed action. The Allied command, focused entirely on the crushing mechanics of a global war, found it difficult to pivot from military strategy to humanitarian intervention based on unverified accounts. President Roosevelt had famously declared that the best way to help the victims was to win the war, a sentiment that prioritized the destruction of the German military machine over the targeting of specific camps. This strategic rigidity was bolstered by a profound intelligence gap. The Allies knew of concentration camps, they knew of forced labor and brutality. But the concept of a camp designed solely for extermination, factories where the product was death itself, was a cognitive leap many were unwilling to make without hard evidence. The technical reality was equally unforgiving. The death camps were buried deep in the heart of Poland, far beyond the range of standard reconnaissance patrols. Auschwitz, Sobibor, Treblinka. These names were mere coordinates on a map, hidden behind the Iron Curtain of the Luftwaffe's eastern defenses. There were no photographs. No aerial surveillance had captured the smoking chimneys or the rail lines terminating at the gas chambers. To the mission planners, these locations were black holes. In February 1943, Winston Churchill had circulated a memo noting the necessity of evidence that would convince not just the Allies, but history itself. "We have reports of mass killings," the sentiment ran, "but no photographs, no proof." The moral paralysis was palpable. Without incontrovertible visual confirmation, the final solution remained an abstract nightmare rather than a tactical target. The world knew something was happening behind the barbed wire, but they could not see it. The truth was shrouded in silence and distance, waiting for someone to dare the impossible flight that could tear the veil away. And in a briefing room not far from London, a specific set of coordinates was about to be circled, demanding a pilot with the nerve to fly into the heart of the darkness. "Malcolm doesn't make mistakes. That's the problem." The comment had drifted across the mess hall weeks ago, spoken by a rear gunner with a pint in his hand, but it still echoed in Malcolm Whiteley's mind as he arranged his pencils in a perfect parallel row. To the rest of the squadron, the nickname "The Machine" was a badge of honor, a testament to the 26-year-old's uncanny ability to thread a bomber through the needle's eye of the Ruhr flak belts and bring them home on the fumes of their fuel tanks. To Malcolm, it felt like a curse carved into his skin. Before the war, his life had been the quiet, dusty solitude of a Cambridge classroom, teaching mathematics to young men who had no idea their futures would be measured in seconds and trajectory angles. He had watched the bedraggled, hollow-eyed soldiers stumbling off the boats from Dunkirk in June 1940 and realized with a cold, hard clarity that courage alone was not enough. Britain did not just need brave hearts, it needed precise minds. He had joined the Royal Air Force to impose order on the chaos, graduating top of his class at RAF Cranwell with scores that the instructors admitted they hadn't seen in a decade. But the precision had curdled into obsession. Malcolm didn't just plot a course, he interrogated it. He kept duplicate navigation logs, one for the official record and one for his own tormented review. While other navigators slept off the adrenaline of a sortie or drank until the sunrise, Malcolm sat in his bunk, recalculating wind drift and ground speed, hunting for the error that hadn't happened yet. "Whiteley men don't make mistakes, Malcolm," his father's voice would whisper from the recesses of his memory, stern and unyielding. "We think before we act." By March 1943, Malcolm had flown 47 missions. He had made 0 errors. Squadron leader Carrington had once slapped him on the back, declaring him the best navigator in the wing, unaware that Malcolm was slowly ulcerating his own stomach lining with worry. In mathematics, there was only right and wrong, no gray area, no margin for good enough. Every mission felt like walking a tightrope over a precipice. The longer he went without falling, the more terrifying the drop became. He was terrified that the law of averages was finally coming for him. On the morning of March 8th, the briefing room smelled of stale tobacco and nervous sweat. The target was deep, deeper than they liked. The primary objective was the IG Farben chemical plant complex under construction near Krakow, a vital industrial artery for the Nazi war machine. "In and out, gentlemen," the intelligence officer said, tapping the map with a pointer. "The Germans have increased fighter patrols in this sector, and their radar net is tightening." Malcolm stared at the map. His eyes drifted from the chemical plant to the secondary target listed for reconnaissance, the railway marshalling yards at a town called Auschwitzum. It was just a name, a cluster of vowels and consonants on a grid, signifying nothing but logistics and steel. He began his ritual, checking the meteorological reports, the fuel load calculations, and the estimated time over target. He ran the numbers once, then twice. The math was perfect, the vector drawn with a steady hand, but as his pencil hovered over the coordinates of the rail yard, a sudden, inexplicable shiver ran down his spine, as if the paper itself was cold to the touch. The de Havilland Mosquito PRMK-16 tore down the runway at RAF Benson at exactly 8:15 a.m., the roar of its twin Merlin engines vibrating through the wooden frame like a living pulse. Malcolm Whiteley sat hunched in the nose, surrounded by the smell of high-octane fuel and the claustrophobic comfort of his maps. The sky was a piercing, innocent blue, offering the kind of visibility reconnaissance pilots prayed for and bomber crews dreaded. As the English coast dissolved into the gray blur of the channel, Malcolm settled into his rhythm, the world reducing itself to a series of vectors, wind speeds, and time checks. They crossed the enemy coast high and fast. The Mosquito, unarmed and built of plywood, relied on speed and altitude for survival. France passed below as a patchwork quilt, followed by the darker, brooding expanse of Germany, and finally the occupied territories of Poland. By 10:32 a.m., the adrenaline of the crossing had settled into a cold, focused trance. Malcolm's pencil hovered over his log, ticking off the checkpoints. They were approaching the target zone. The plan was precise, a sweeping run over the IG Farben chemical complex near Krakow. He glanced at his chart, his eyes locking onto the longitude. 19 degrees 50 minutes east. It was a number he had written down during the briefing, a number he had checked against the stars and the sun. Approaching target area, Squadron Leader Carrington's voice crackled over the intercom, tinny and distorted by the oxygen mask. Cameras hot in 30 seconds. Give me the final vector. Malcolm looked at his navigation log. He read the numbers. He adjusted the course. Turned to heading 095. The Mosquito banked smoothly. Malcolm felt the familiar satisfaction of a calculation resolving itself into reality. But as the plane leveled out and the cameras began to click, the landscape below didn't match the mental image he had constructed. He was expecting the jagged industrial skyline of a chemical plant, cooling towers, smoke, the dense knot of heavy industry. Instead, he saw geometry. Malcolm, check your position, Carrington said, his tone shifting from professional to puzzled. This doesn't look like a chemical plant. Malcolm leaned forward, pressing his face toward the observation port. Below them, carved out of the Polish countryside, was a sprawling, terrifyingly orderly rectangle. It stretched for miles, a grid of wooden barracks arranged in rows so precise they looked like lines drawn on a draftsman's table. There were no factories. There were no smokestacks typical of chemical production. There was only a massive railway spur that split the compound like a scar, ending at a long, flat platform. Where the hell are we, Malcolm? Carrington asked. Malcolm scrambled for his charts, his heart hammering against his ribs. He traced his line back. He looked at the target coordinates, 19 degrees 50 minutes. Then he looked at his flight log, the numbers he had actually calculated and fed to the pilot. 19 degrees 5 minutes. The blood drained from his face. He had transposed the 5 and the 0. It was a rookie mistake, a slip of the pencil that no machine should ever make. He had guided them 40 miles west of their target. I made a mistake, Malcolm whispered, the words tasting like ash. We're off course. 40 miles west. They weren't over Krakow. They were over a secondary rail hub, a place marked on the map with the German name for the local town of Auschwitz. Auschwitz, Malcolm breathed, reading the name off the chart. Below them, the camera shutters continued to click, capturing frame after frame of the impossible grid. Malcolm stared down, his mind reeling from his own failure, unaware that his error had just captured the first aerial evidence of the century's greatest crime. But as the Mosquito banked to correct its course, Malcolm's eye caught something moving on the platform below. A train, disgorging thousands of tiny dark specks that did not move like soldiers, but like cattle herded toward the edge of the world. The automatic shutters of the F-24 cameras mounted in the Mosquito's belly began to cycle, click-whir, click-whir, a mechanical heartbeat capturing a reality the human mind refused to process. At 11,000 feet, the world usually dissolved into abstract shapes, but the air over Upper Silesia was crystalline, magnification unnecessary to see the anomaly scarring the earth. There are multiple compounds, Carrington said, his voice tight with confusion. This looks massive. Miles of it. Malcolm pressed his face against the observation port, his breath fogging the perspex. Below them, the rigid geometry he had mistaken for an industrial park revealed itself as a city of the damned. There were no cooling towers, no blast furnaces. Instead, hundreds of low wooden barracks sat in mud-choked rows, surrounded by double lines of fencing that glinted even from this height, barbed wire, likely electrified. But it was the smoke that held Malcolm's gaze. It didn't billow in the thick black plumes of burning oil or coal. It rose in greasy gray columns from square buildings with tall brick chimneys, drifting over the camp like a shroud. "Are those prisoners?" Carrington asked, banking slightly to keep the target in frame. "Is this a POW camp?" Malcolm squinted. On the ground, thousands of figures moved in slow, jagged formations. They were ant-like from 2 miles up, but the uniformity was unmistakable, drab, striped indistinction. Then, his eyes traced the perimeter of a large brick structure at the edge of the complex. Beside it lay a chaotic pale heap. It looked like a stack of timber until he realized the logs had limbs. "James," Malcolm said, his voice sounding foreign to his own ears. "Descend to 9,000 feet. "What?" "Malcolm, the briefing said stay high. We need to leave." "Descend," Malcolm shouted, snapping out of his usual deferential calm. "We need clear photographs. Now." Carrington didn't argue. He pushed the yoke forward, and the Mosquito dropped, the engines whining as speed built up. The ground rushed up to meet them, resolving the horror into high definition. At 9,000 feet, the abstraction vanished. Malcolm could see the guard towers punctuating the perimeter. He saw the dogs. He saw the SS men standing casually by the wire. And he saw the platform. A train had stopped at the railhead. The doors of the cattle cars were open, and a river of humanity was spilling out onto the ramp. It was a selection process. Guards were flicking riding crops, dividing the stream into 2 currents. One flowing toward the barracks, the other flowing toward the buildings with the chimneys. "Christ, Malcolm," Carrington choked out. "Are those bodies near the crematorium? Look at the flames." The chimneys were belching fire now, a terrible, persistent orange against the snow-dusted ground. The cameras continued their relentless work, capturing the impossible every few seconds. Malcolm's hands shook so violently he could barely hold his pencil, yet he forced himself to scribble notes on his log pad. "Chimneys, fences, selection, flak." Carrington yelled as black puffs of smoke blossomed off their starboard wing. The German anti-aircraft batteries had woken up. "Time to leave, Malcolm." Carrington hauled the Mosquito into a hard climb, engines screaming as they fought for altitude and safety. Gravity pressed Malcolm into his seat, but he twisted his neck to get one last look at the receding nightmare. On the tracks leading into the complex, another locomotive was chugging slowly toward the ramp, pulling a long chain of wooden slats. "They're bringing more people," Malcolm whispered, the vibration of the plane rattling his bones. "James, look at the tracks. They're bringing more people." As the Mosquito vanished into the cloud layer, hiding the genocide from view once more, Malcolm clutched the navigation log to his chest. The error was no longer a mistake. It was a burden. He had seen the Devil's Foundry, and now the most dangerous thing in the sky wasn't the flak or the fighters. It was the film canister sitting in the dark belly of the plane, holding a truth that could shatter the Allied conscience. The return flight was a blur of velocity and vibration, the Mosquito screaming westward across the German Reich at nearly 400 miles per hour. For the first hour, the intercom remained dead. The silence between pilot and navigator was heavier than the G-force of their escape, a dense, suffocating weight that filled the tiny cockpit. Malcolm sat paralyzed, his eyes fixed on the navigation log resting on his knees, but he wasn't seeing the vectors or the fuel consumption rates. He was seeing the grid. His mind, conditioned by years of Cambridge mathematics and RAF precision, began to do the one thing it could not stop doing. It calculated. He visualized the number of barracks they had flown over. 50 buildings per sector. Maybe 60. He estimated the dimensions based on the altitude. Capacity, perhaps 200 souls per structure. Maybe more if they packed them like livestock. He multiplied the sectors. He factored in the trains. He added the smoke. The sum was a statistical impossibility, a number so large it felt like a violation of natural law. It wasn't a prison. It was a factory where the raw material was human life and the output was ash. "Malcolm," Carrington's voice finally broke through the static, hollow and sounding far older than his 28 years. "What did we just see?" Malcolm swallowed, his throat dry as sandpaper. "I don't know," he stammered. "A holding camp? But the chimneys, the pits." "There had to be thousands of them," Carrington said, his gaze fixed on the horizon as they crossed back over the French coast. "Tens of thousands." "James," Malcolm said quietly, his finger tracing the transposed numbers on his chart, the 50 and the 05 that had altered their destiny. "I made a mistake. I wrote the longitude wrong. I took us to the wrong place." The confession hung in the air, the admission of the machine's first failure. He waited for the reprimand, for the anger that a navigator's incompetence had risked a valuable aircraft and crew for a non-objective. Instead, Carrington sighed, a long, trembling exhalation. Good. I'm glad you made that mistake, Malcolm. Because if you hadn't, nobody would know that place exists. They crossed the English Channel under the cover of a thick cloud layer, descending into the familiar drab greenery of Oxfordshire. At 2:47 p.m., the Mosquito's tires kissed the tarmac at RAF Benson. The aircraft taxied to its hard stand, the engine sputtering into silence, leaving a ringing void in their ears. When the ground crew approached to chock the wheels and place the ladder, they stopped short. Usually, crews returned flushed with adrenaline or exhausted from the strain. But as Malcolm and Carrington climbed down, they looked like ghosts. Their faces were drained of color, their eyes wide and haunted. A corporal stepped forward to take the flight log, joking about an easy run, but the words died in his throat when he saw Malcolm's hands. They were trembling so violently he could barely undo his harness buckles. Malcolm stood on the tarmac, the damp English air cooling his sweat-soaked flight suit. His perfect record was broken. He was no longer the navigator who never failed. But as he looked toward the photo intelligence bay, where a runner was already sprinting to collect the film magazines from the belly of the plane, he realized that his perfection had been meaningless all along. The numbers on his page were just ink. The truth was coiled inside those dark canisters, a terrifying negative waiting to be developed into positive proof. And as the runner disappeared into the photo interpretation section, Malcolm felt a sudden, sickening dread, not for what he had seen, but for what the developers were about to find when they turned on the red lights. The interrogation room at RAF Benson felt colder than the cockpit at altitude. Wing Commander Davies sat behind his desk, tapping a pen against the wood, listening to the most decorated navigator in the squadron dismantle his own reputation. "Sir, I made a navigation error," Malcolm said, his voice steady but hollow. "I transposed the coordinates. We photographed the wrong target." Davies frowned. "What did you photograph instead, Flight Sergeant?" "A massive camp complex near Auschwitz. We believe it is a German concentration camp, but—" Malcolm faltered. How could he describe the geometry of death he had calculated from the air? The film canisters were rushed by courier to the Central Interpretation Unit at RAF Medinum. There, in the quiet, sterile room smelling of developer fluid and acetate, the truth was pulled from the chemicals. On March 9, 1943, Section Officer Sarah Mitchell placed the first wet print under her stereoscope. She adjusted the focus, leaned in, and then immediately recoiled. She covered her mouth, her face turning the color of chalk, and bolted for the lavatory without a word. Squadron Leader Peter Hamish, the chief interpreter, took her place. He stared through the lenses for a long time. The silence in the room stretched until it was unbearable. Finally, he straightened up. "Get Group Captain Morrison," he said softly. Immediately. When Morrison arrived, the mood in the room was brittle. Malcolm and Carrington stood by the wall, exhausted and anxious, while the senior officers huddled over the light box. "It's a POW camp," Morrison declared, his tone dismissive as he straightened his tunic. "Large, certainly. But we know they have camps in Poland." "Sir, look at this building." Malcolm stepped forward, ignoring protocol. He pointed to the T-shaped structure with the tall chimney. "Those are crematoria." Morrison's eyes narrowed. "Flight Sergeant, you are not a photo interpreter." "I'm a mathematician, sir," Malcolm interrupted, his voice rising. "Look at the scale. Look at the shadows of the vents. Look at the number of ovens implied by that architecture. That facility is not designed for disposing of occasional deaths from typhus. It is an industrial processing plant." "Sir, the flight sergeant is correct," Hamish added, his voice grim. "This facility is designed for mass cremation. The capacity estimates are staggering." Morrison's face hardened into a mask of bureaucratic granite. "This mission was unauthorized. You deviated from your flight plan. You missed the IG Farben plant, a priority 1 target, to chase ghosts." "Sir," Carrington stepped in, "we discovered it by accident, but we made additional passes deliberately. This needs to be reported to command." "Report what?" Morrison snapped. "That you found a German camp? This is outside our operational mandate. We are here to identify factories, U-boat pens, and marshalling yards. We are fighting a war, not compiling a census of Nazi prisons." "Sir, I've flown 47 perfect missions," Malcolm said, his hands clenched into fists. "I made one error. That error revealed something that makes perfect missions meaningless. People are being murdered there by the thousands. You can see the smoke. Flight Sergeant, you photograph military targets, Morrison said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You do not engage in intelligence assessment or policy recommendations. You are grounded pending review of your unauthorized deviation. Dismissed. As Malcolm and Carrington were ushered out, stunned and defeated, Morrison turned to leave, satisfied the matter was closed. But Hamish remained at the light table. He watched his superior walk away, then looked back down at the grainy image of the smoking chimneys. He reached for a file stamp, hovered over the folder, and then set it down. Sir, Hamish called out to Morrison's retreating back, his voice trembling slightly. I'm sending these photographs to Bomber Command Headquarters. With or without your authorization. Morrison stopped at the door, turning slowly, his expression unreadable. But before he could respond, the phone on the wall began to ring, a harsh, jarring sound in the silent room. It was the red line, the direct link to the Air Ministry, and whoever was on the other end already knew that something impossible had been found in the east. The photographs traveled up the chain of command like a slow-acting poison, sickening everyone who touched them. On March 11th, they arrived at the Air Ministry, where Air Vice Marshal Norman Bottomley reviewed the glossy prints under the harsh light of his desk lamp. He had seen bomb damage assessments of Cologne and Hamburg, cities turned to rubble, but this was different. Rubble was the chaotic byproduct of war. This was the orderly architecture of extermination. By the morning of March 13th, the dossier was in the hands of Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden. Known for his diplomatic composure, Eden sat in silence for a long time, the color draining from his face, before closing the folder with a sharp snap. Get these to the Prime Minister, he ordered. Immediately. 2 days later, the air in the cabinet war rooms was thick with cigar smoke and the low hum of ventilation fans. The heavy steel doors were shut, sealing the room from the London Blitz above. Winston Churchill sat at the head of the long table, a magnifying glass in his hand, hovering over the prints spread across the green baize. Beside him stood Eden, Chief of the Air Staff Charles Portal, and a cluster of grim-faced intelligence officers. Churchill did not speak. He leaned in, the glass magnifying the grain of the film until the blurred shapes of the prisoners and the smoking chimneys filled his vision. He traced the rail lines with a finger, following the tracks to the selection ramp. Finally he sat back, the leather chair creaking under his weight. He looked tired, his eyes heavy with a new, terrible knowledge. So the reports are true, he rumbled, his voice lacking its usual combative timbre. All of them. The Poles were not exaggerating. It appears the Nazi extermination program is far more systematic than we believed, Eden said quietly. This is not a camp. It is a slaughterhouse. We must act, Churchill said, looking around the table. We could bomb the railway lines leading to the camp, Portal suggested, pointing to the spur line on the map. Cut the flow. A representative from Bomber Command shifted uncomfortably. Sir, with respect, precision bombing of a rail line at that range, deep in Silesia, is incredibly difficult. The Germans repair tracks in 24 hours. To keep it closed, we would need to divert heavy bombers from industrial targets in the Ruhr. We would be trading the destruction of German war capacity for a temporary delay in their operations. What about the gas chambers themselves? Eden asked. Destroy the machinery. A daylight raid at that distance would be suicide without fighter escort, an intelligence officer countered. A night raid would require area bombing. We would likely kill as many prisoners as guards. The collateral damage would be catastrophic. Churchill slammed his hand on the table, rattling the ashtrays. What are we saying? That it is too difficult to try to stop mass murder? Are we fighting for civilization only to let it perish behind wire? The room fell silent. The cold calculus of total war hung in the air. Military efficiency versus moral imperative. The strategists were right. Diverting resources could prolong the war, potentially costing more lives in the long run. But the photographs on the table screamed for intervention. I want options prepared, Churchill growled. But first I want confirmation. We cannot rely on a single accidental pass. Send another reconnaissance mission to this location and to any other suspected sites. We need a comprehensive map of this hell. He gathered the photographs, his hands trembling slightly. These images must be preserved. When this war ends, the world must see what the Nazis have done. We will share these with President Roosevelt and Premier Stalin. But we cannot release them to the press yet. The Germans will claim it as faked propaganda, and we cannot risk our intelligence sources. The meeting broke up, the men filing out with heavy steps. But as the order for new reconnaissance missions was typed up and sent down the wire to the airfields, a new problem arose. The Americans were now involved, and across the Atlantic, a young, brash commander in the U.S. Army Air Forces was looking at the same map of Poland, wondering if his B-17s could do what the RAF claimed was impossible. The knock on the door of the bachelor's quarters was sharp and authoritative. When Malcolm Whiteley opened it, he expected a disciplinary officer. Instead, he found Wing Commander Davies standing in the hallway, looking uncomfortably at his boots. The grounding order had been in effect for 11 days, 11 days in which Malcolm had done nothing but stare at the ceiling and replay the images from the darkroom in his mind. "Pack your kit, Flight Sergeant," Davies said, his voice low. "You're no longer grounded." Malcolm blinked. "Sir? I was wrong to discipline you for the deviation. Command doesn't just want the photos you took. They want more. They want confirmation." Davies met his eyes. "You and Carrington are flying back to Auschwitz." On the morning of March 22, 1943, the Mosquito PRMK-16 lifted off the tarmac at 7:30 a.m. The physical mechanics of the flight were identical to the last. The roar of the Merlins, the vibration of the wooden airframe, the cold solitude of the stratosphere. But the psychological weight was crushing. 2 weeks ago, they had been hunting a chemical plant and stumbled upon a nightmare. Today, they were flying deliberately into the heart of it. By 10:15 a.m., the cloud cover over Upper Silesia began to break, tearing open like a curtain to reveal the stage below. "Target ahead," Carrington said. "I see the rail lines." Malcolm pressed his face to the glass, a knot of nausea tightening in his stomach. "I don't want to see it again, James." "Neither do I," the pilot replied, leveling the wings. "But someone has to." The complex had changed even in just 2 weeks. It was growing like a malignancy. From 25,000 feet, Malcolm could see new scars in the earth where foundations for additional barracks were being dug. But his eyes were drawn inevitably to the railhead. A fresh train had arrived, a snake of 40 cattle cars idling on the spur. The platform was a swarm of black uniforms and striped pajamas. The selection was underway. Malcolm watched through the lens as the stream of people was bifurcated. One line marching toward the labor camp, the other, larger line herded toward the buildings with the chimneys. They stayed over the target for 20 minutes, defying the flak batteries to capture every angle. They photographed the main camp, the sprawling extermination center at Birkenau, and the industrial complex at Monowitz, where the IG Farben plant stood in symbiotic horror with the death camp. The connection was undeniable. Slave labor fed the factory and the factory fed the war. When they landed, Malcolm didn't sleep. He spent the next 3 weeks in the air, flying a grim tour of occupied Poland. On March 25, they flew over Treblinka. The camp appeared dismantled, the ground churned up to hide the evidence, but the massive burial pits and earthworks were visible from the air, a scar the Nazis couldn't erase. On March 28, they mapped Belzec. On April 2, Sobibor, where the gas chambers were fully active. On April 5, they photographed the massive complex at Majdanek near Lublin. The pattern was absolute. It wasn't an isolated atrocity, it was a continental network. Malcolm labeled the final map, his hand steady now with the certainty of the damned. Systematic extermination. But as he handed the dossier to intelligence, he knew that proving the crime was only half the battle. The evidence was undeniable, but across the Atlantic, a new argument was brewing, one that would pit the desire to save lives against the cold logistics of winning the war, and the next voice to speak would belong to a man who believed bombing paved the only road to salvation. By April 1943, as the Warsaw Ghetto erupted in a final, desperate flame of resistance, Malcolm Whiteley's photographs lay on the heavy oak tables of the War Cabinet. They were no longer secrets, but they were not yet salvation. Anthony Eden argued that history would judge their silence as complicity, leading to a muted acknowledgement, a few lines in a newspaper, a censored broadcast. But the bombers did not come. The logic of total war was a cold equation. Diverting resources to save a specific group might prolong the conflict for everyone. "We must win the war to stop this," Churchill had noted, a sentiment that tasted like ash to Malcolm as he read the intelligence reports of continuing transports. The horror continued, documented but undisturbed. Malcolm flew D-Day reconnaissance, his cameras clicking over the liberation of Europe, yet his mind remained trapped in Silesia. The breaking point arrived in August 1944. The U.S. 15th Air Force launched a massive daylight raid against the IG Farben synthetic rubber plant at Auschwitz-Monowitz. The B-17s flew directly over the gas chambers of Birkenau to hit the factory. They dropped their payloads on the slave labor site but spared the machinery of death mere miles away. When Malcolm heard the report, that the ovens were left standing while the factory burned, He didn't scream. He simply collapsed in the mess hall, hospitalized for exhaustion, his spirit fractured by the operational precision he had worshipped his entire life. Vindication, when it came, was judicial, not military. In November 1945, at the Palace of Justice in Nuremberg, the courtroom lights dimmed. A screen descended. Prosecution Exhibit RAF 423, Malcolm's Error, was projected for the world to see. The Nazi defendants, stripped of their uniforms and arrogance, stared in shock. They had believed their crimes were hidden behind the smoke. The RAF had captured them in silver nitrate. Malcolm, who had refused to attend his medal ceremony, sat in Cambridge, knowing that his lens had stripped the defense of "we didn't know." He returned to the quiet order of mathematics, marrying, raising children, and burying the war beneath layers of calculus and silence. But the ghosts were patient. In 1963, he testified anonymously at the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials, his voice low and steady as he used his flight logs to establish the timeline of murder that helped convict 22 men. It wasn't until 1978 that he finally spoke on the record. Sitting in his study, surrounded by the safety of books, he offered a brutal epitaph for his generation. "I spent my entire career afraid of making mistakes," he told the historian. "Then I made an error that revealed the greatest evil in history. But revealing evil isn't the same as stopping it. I showed them where it was. They chose not to bomb it. Truth without action is just academic knowledge of evil." Malcolm died in 1989. In a locked filing cabinet, his children found the original prints, preserved in darkness. Attached was a note: "So we never forget what humans are capable of. And so we remember that witnessing is not enough." He had left the world with the evidence, but as the century turned, a new question began to form, not about what the Allies had seen, but about what the next generation would choose to look at. For in the archives of a different intelligence agency, a new folder was being created, marked with the name of a small African nation, and the satellite photos were already beginning to arrive. Malcolm kept these photos in a locked cabinet so we would never forget. If you leave this video without engaging, you are locking them away again. Do your part to keep the truth in the light. Subscribe, like, and comment. Never forget right now. Do not let the past die with the witnesses.